Hey students, we're going to be back in person here again soon, I hope. And as of right now, we are scheduled to be back next week. However, we'll only meet once next week because of testing on Tuesday and Wednesday. So, B Block would meet on Monday, but then that's the only time that week, and D Block would then meet on Thursday, but that would be the only time that week that would actually meet. So we're really running out of time here. Then the week after, is tulip time where we have Monday, Tuesday, full days, normal, in person, but then the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are half days. But anyways, in those days are remote, and they're meeting like AB on Wednesday remote, CD on Thursday, EF on Friday. But anyways, guys, so here we go. Chapter 31, The Moral Majority. This is founded by a televangelist. It's like a combination of like TV, television, and evangelist. So it's like a religious guy in the televangelist Jerry Falwell. And he claims that the politicians aren't listening to Christians and religious people and so forth. So he's going to create this moral majority to kind of like create like a voting block of Christians. And the Republicans tend to court the moral majority more. And some people argue back then at the time here, I'm talking like 60s, 70s. And some people say you kind of still see that today. And although the moral majority doesn't necessarily exist today as Jerry Falwell had it, some people argue it still kind of exists today, and that the Republican Party arguably still kind of caters more to this type of concept or these type of voters. You start to get this thing kind of forming in this era here, this late 60s, 70s, 80s, called neoconservatives. They're oftentimes former liberals, and they tended to support Ronald Reagan. In fact, Ronald Reagan himself was a neocon. And they had tended to be liberals, and they thought that had been liberals, and they tended to fear that America was lowering itself, lowering its standards for a lot of liberal policies, and weakening America's position. And they tended to argue for less social spending, more foreign intervention, taking a tough line in the Cold War, stuff like that. Ronald Reagan himself had been a former Democrat, had supported highly FDR, and actually, even my understanding is for his whole life kind of thought highly of FDR. But I started to reject the Democratic Party, thinking that it was lowering standards, weakening America, in its pursuit of liberal policies here. And so they had kind of like left the Democratic Party, neocons, new conservatives. Signs. The late 60s, early 70s are oftentimes thought of as a tumultuous kind of era. Look at this up here a second here. Here's this artwork by this guy with the last name of Rauschenberg, and I'll kind of get in there a little bit better here, but you can see kind of like the tumult of the 60s in this little artwork collage here. You can see, well, you have some highs too. Like, for example, 1969, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, right? With the Apollo moon missions. But then you got, Vietnam and the war protests you can see up in the far left corner there. And you got like Janis Joplin, Robert Kennedy, who unfortunately is assassinated, JFK, who's unfortunately assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr., who's unfortunately assassinated. You have race riots in urban areas, unrest, more Vietnam War stuff. You have some more protests and stuff going on up there. In the lower right corner, down here, let me see if I can point to it with I forget a finger in the camera lens. There we go. Right there, you can see part of the Zapruder film. That's this guy who filmed JFK getting assassinated in Texas. He's actually standing basically where the so-called grassy knoll was on part of it. But anyways, But you can see the kind of the tumult of the 60s, kind of like you have some highs, you have some tragic lows, you have protests, you have the Vietnam War, you have riots, you have this, you have that. And so that's kind of what's kind of going on there. But anyways, Nixon becomes president in 1968. And some people argue he's more liberal than conservative, and this is debatable, but I have come across this argument multiple times with Nixon. He's actually more liberal than conservative, or wouldn't fit into the modern day Republican Party as much. But look at here, 1952, he's vice president, or actually in 1952 he's running for vice president, and he gives this famous speech, this Checkers speech, which kind of endears him, believe it or not, to the American public. What the Checkers speech was Eisenhower said, technically slush funds weren't illegal, but people could put like money in a bank account and politicians could withdraw from them. And to make a long story short, Eisenhower said basically, slush funds aren't illegal, but they're immoral and they really shouldn't have them. And I won't have a slush fund, and people connected to me won't have a slush fund. Well, now his running mate, Nixon, Eisenhower's running mate, Nixon, is accused of having a slush fund in 1952. And he goes on TV and says, I don't have a slush fund. Look, my wife, and he gives this famous Checkers speech, and he says, look, my wife wears a plain cloth Republican coat, not a fancy fur coat or anything like that. Look at the car I drive. It's a normal American car. And he says, look, the only thing I did accept was this dog, and my kids loved it, so I kept it, and they named it Checkers. And, I'd rather not be vice president than give back the dog and break my kids' hearts. And America eats it up. Eisenhower had actually kind of made up his mind to dump Nixon, but then after the Checkers speech, hey, Nixon's all of a sudden popular. I have to keep him. He's my guy again. 1959, he becomes more popular with the American public because he travels to Moscow and he has his famous kitchen debates. And if you log on to the lecture notes there, you can click that hyperlink there and see part of the kitchen debates. But he debates Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and a lot of Americans love it. I think he does a good job. He stands up to Khrushchev. Khrushchev is like bullying and berating America, and Nixon, holds his ground and pushes right back into Khrushchev with the famous kitchen debates. And basically the point of the kitchen debates, or Nixon's argument, is that you can tell America's better than the Soviet Union because of our kitchens. It's full of products, full of food. We have different food products. You go to the grocery store, there's tons of different options that you can choose from. Nixon's the first president to kind of put in place a serious affirmative action policy. JFK kind of had, LBJ kind of had. Nixon has the first explicit affirmative action policy. And basically, George Shultz is this guy who helps put it into place, and it's based off this Philadelphia plan. And so basically, the government kind of leaves it up to these construction companies, but it tells construction companies, if you want to keep government contracts, if you want to win new government contracts, you have to put in place to hire minority workers. You can't just have like 100% white workers or something along the lines of that if you want to have government contracts, because the government's constantly building things, whether it's highways or bridges or overpasses or this or that. The government's constantly building things, government buildings. And so you have this affirmative action policy here. Nixon helps create the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and Nixon helps put into place the highest standards for air pollution that we've ever had. They've actually been undone in the 80s by Ronald Reagan, but the highest air quality standards we've ever had was under Nixon. And you might think, we have higher ones today. No, not necessarily. Many of these laws were actually better back then than they are today. Occupational Safety and Health Administration he helps create, which is everyone just calls it OSHA instead of this long title here. But OSHA helps create safety standards for the workplace. As a teacher, I've had to do some OSHA training over the years about learning about okay, what if a student bleeds? How do you clean it up? You can't just let the kids play around in the blood, or there's somebody breaks glass. How do you take care of it? And all sorts of occupational safety standards put out by OSHA that Nixon helps create here. Desegregation, his record's a bit mixed here. He'd been a big supporter of desegregation in the 1950s, Nixon had, but when he loses the African American vote in that famous 1960 election to JFK, Nixon starts kind of pushing the responsibility for desegregation off the courts. And this helps him a little bit in the South with some of the white Southern voters, saying, look, it's up to the courts. If the courts say to desegregate, I'll desegregate whatever they tell me to. But he places the burden on the courts instead of being like hey, I'm leading rah from the front. Let's desegregate this. It's kind of like, if the courts tell me to desegregate something, boom, I'll do it. If they don't, we'll just, it's kind of like play it by ear. China had turned communist. You remember back under Harry Truman, it actually hurt President Truman politically because he was supposed to do something about it. And some people argue that's one of the reasons why he gets involved in the Korean War, Truman does. But presidents had this policy to kind of ignore China, not have relations with China, not recognize the Chinese government. If you don't know, we recognize Taiwan because like the non-communist Chinese fled to Taiwan and set up a government there. But anyways, to make a long story short, Nixon travels to China and opens up friendly relations with China. In fact, it was said that only Nixon could do it. And what they meant by that was that because of like the Red Scare and communism's bad and people thinking that and saying that and being paranoid over communists, that had the only person who could do this type of a thing would be somebody who was like so strong against communism. And the fact that Nixon went to China and set up good relations and the Chinese people ate it up and loved it, and that only he could do that, normalize relations with China. Nixon also pushes détente. Remember, he had been vice president under Eisenhower. What was one of the big things Eisenhower tried to do was reduce Cold War tensions. What is Nixon doing now that he's president? He's trying to ease Cold War tensions. And we have this period of détente where, we still have severe problems with the Soviet Union, but it's not quite as bad as it had been. And what's an example of this? SALT. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, SALT 1. And they didn't call it SALT 1 at first. They call it SALT 1 because later on there's going to be a SALT 2. But, so in 1972, the U.S. and Soviet Union put limits on missile tests for 5 years, and limits on missiles for 5 years. And so kind of this easing of the arms race, if that makes sense. One of Nixon's strategies he does is this Vietnamization. We're going to reduce, he inherits the Vietnam War, which LBJ had dramatically escalated. And we're going to reduce the amount of American soldiers fighting while increasing the amount of South Vietnamese fighting. And so that's Vietnamization. You have the Kent State shooting. There's another link there, but just for brevity, I'm going to kind of keep rolling through some of this here. But the Kent State shooting, unfortunately, the National Guard in Ohio at Kent State University fires into some college protests. There have been lots of protests, protesting the Vietnam War, protesting, maybe racism or this or that. But they're protesting the Vietnam War in this case, and fired in, killing a few and wounding several students. And a lot of people were just deeply upset by that, deeply disturbed, and there's a video of it, and you can see some of the chaos and the ambulance trying to take some of the wounded or severely wounded to the hospital, and Nixon wasn't supportive of the protesters, which made a lot of people start to turn against him, or at least of the protesting group. But don't forget, though, Nixon wins re-election. Nixon wins re-election with 49 of 50 states. And we've only had 50 states since the 1950s. But Nixon's only one of two people to win 49 of 50 states. It's amazing when you actually think about it. The Family Assistance Plan. Nixon proposes this. It ends up not passing. Congress doesn't like it. But think about this. Nixon says, look, America, we have this American standard of living, And not everyone's getting the American standard of living. And Nixon, I'm not saying he's right, I'm not saying he's wrong, but Nixon says the current welfare system, as designed by LBJ, encourages people not to work. Maybe Nixon's right, maybe he's wrong, but Nixon says it's encouraging people not to work. And we could either pay people not to work or we could pay people to work. So Nixon's proposed plan here, the family assistance plan, is if you're working, you're guaranteed an American standard of living. So and it's based on like how many mouths you have to feed. For example, if you're a single guy, you don't need as much money for an American standard of living if you're like, let's say, a single mom with 5 kids, because then you have lots of mouths to feed, right? And so they put it into a formula based on how many people are in your family. They put it into a formula kind of based on locality, because some areas have a higher cost of living, like San Francisco. Some areas have a lower cost of living. Holland actually has a relatively low cost of living compared to the nation as a whole. But the fact of the matter is, this family assistance plan, as long as you're working, the government will pay you up to, will contribute money to your salary to get you up to the American standard of living with this family assistance plan. Because Nixon believes the current welfare system, right or wrong, is paying people not to work. Nixon says, I want to pay people to work. I'd rather have people working and collecting welfare than not working and collecting welfare. And then you got this Watergate scandal. There is literally this group called CREEP. It's an acronym. CREEP stood for Committee to Re-elect the President. And CREEP had broken into the Watergate hotel and office complex. The office complex part held the Democratic National Committee. And CREEP had broke in there to kind of spy and get information on what the Democrats were doing. Whether Nixon knew about the break-in beforehand doesn't matter, because the fact of the matter is he knew about it after the fact. Instead of coming forward and saying, look, this is what I discovered. And a lot of historians think he would have been A-okay had he done that and just instantly come forward and said, oh, I just found out some people trying to re-elect me did this, but instead he covers it up. And that is what does him in. It's obstruction of justice. You're lying to the American people and all this. And in the late 60s and the 70s, you start to get stagflation. And stagflation is a merger of two words, because it's a stagnant economy and there's high inflation. In fact, a lot of people thought that it was impossible to have high inflation with a stagnant economy and unemployment, not doing well. The numbers are higher than what you would want. And so you're going to have to see a lot of the, Nixon, Ford, Carter have to deal with this. Reagan becomes president, has to deal with this. So this stagflation lasts from, it starts to creep in the late 60s, and then it's full blown by like the mid 70s, and it lasts into the early 80s there. So this is like a very down, severe economic time. Now, it's not as bad as the Great Depression, but it's really hurting a lot of people here. Now, you start to get this Rust Belt, and here's a video you can click, a CNN video where they talk about like struggles in the Rust Belt, and CNN was talking during the 2016 election about how Trump was doing very well in the Rust Belt areas. Why was Trump doing so well in the Rust Belt areas? Because he was constantly talking about losing jobs to China, losing jobs to Mexico, losing jobs, and he was saying, I'm going to keep your jobs, I'm going to save your jobs. And that message was, people in the Rust Belt love that. But let me kind of come up here a second. This yellow area is the Rust Belt. And you can see there's even some kind of down here in like, Philadelphia area and stuff like that. And the green area is kind of like recovered Rust Belt areas. You can see like Boston area. But the fact of the matter is this yellow Rust Belt area, you can see it's heavily centered on the Great Lakes region. And this yellow area had become the heart of America's industry. Like in the 1800s, the heart of America's industry was like through here. But then, by the end of the Second Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s, the heart of America's industry is in places like Detroit, with the automobile industry in places like Gary, Indiana, down by Chicago area with the steel industry, and all of that. And so this Rust Belt, it starts to creep in. A lot of people say actually like in the late 50s, but it creeps in so slowly, people don't really even notice it in the late 50s. And then it gets a little bit worse in the 60s, and you kind of start to notice it in the 60s, but by the 70s, it becomes a problem. In the 1980s, it's a problem. And people, like, for example, let me give you, Michigan and Ohio are the two hardest hit states from this whole Rust Belt. And a lot of people say Michigan was the hardest hit state from this whole Rust Belt phenomenon. But you have a decline in manufacturing jobs. Let me just give you an example. Flint, all these towns on here are listed because they're considered Rust Belt cities that lost during the Rust Belt here. And Flint, for example, I believe I'm getting these numbers right. I'm getting old, and it's been a while since I did some reading on it. I could be wrong, but I think Flint, all told, had something like over 90,000 jobs from GM at one point. And that's a lot. And GM has tons of different companies. They own like a sparks plug company, but they own Buick and Chevy and all sorts of companies. But the fact of the matter is, at one point they had something like 90,000 jobs in the city of Flint supported by GM. And today it's something like 9,000. They've lost literally like 90% of the GM jobs. And that's just crushed Flint. It's economically devastated Flint. And Flint at one point was named the worst city in America. And it's still a rough place. And they had a water crisis recently, which it doesn't have much to do with the Rust Belt specifically, at least directly. I guess indirectly you get the poverty and stuff like that. But and it collapses businesses that have nothing to do with the declining automobile industry and the declining factories. And the factories are declining because of automation. They're declining because of outsourcing, shipping jobs to cheaper labor countries, but also automation, like computers and machineries and robotics making factories more efficient. But even if you didn't have a collapsing a factory in Flint job, you still might have lost your job, because as Flint literally loses so many of its jobs to the declining automobile industry, it hurts all the others. It hurts restaurants, it hurts pet stores, it hurts everything. Muskegon was at one point named the second worst city in America. Detroit was named, as one of the worst cities to live. But it's called the Rust Belt because you have all these vacant factories just empty, resting away, sitting idle. So that's something that is, and it's crucial to Michigan history here. But OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, countries like Saudi Arabia and so forth, and we upset OPEC. A lot of them are in the Middle East, not all, but a lot of them are in the Middle East, and they don't like Israel, and the U.S. is helping build up Israel's military. And they're not happy about that. And when the Arab-Israeli war breaks out in 73, because we had contributed to Israel's rise militarily, OPEC places an embargo on selling oil to the U.S. And so gas prices shoot up. In fact, there's even some states for a while even literally do things like if you have an even numbered license plate, you can only buy gas on even days, and if you're an odd license plate on the odd days. And so kind of keep that in mind. And this OPEC causes gas prices to skyrocket. It helps with that stagflation, and by helps I mean helps make it worse, the stagflation, because inflation, a rising price and costs. Well, if gas is going up, a lot of other things go up, because remember, a lot of things move by semi-truck, so if gas prices go up, other prices go up, and it's more expensive for people to commute and etc. You get this Bracero program too that kind of starts to end here in the mid 60s. We had worked out a deal with the Mexican government to have Mexican laborers come north into the U.S. to work during World War II. But then the Mexican government says we want those workers back. Most of those workers don't want to go back, and the U.S. physically forces a lot of those workers to go back into Mexico. You can see here in the late 60s and then the early 70s, you get the the American Indian movement starts to rise up. Their most famous incident is here at this time at Alcatraz, this island which had been like a prison in the harbor outside of San Francisco there. And they take it over. These Native Americans take it over. And so you can see Native Americans pushing for more rights. In fact, the Martin Luther King Jr., his civil rights push encouraged a lot of people to kind of do this sort of thing, push for rights. Gerald Ford, he becomes president when Nixon has to resign for Watergate. He pardons Nixon. Very controversially, he says he does it to kind of like put the scandal behind the country, not divide the country further. But it costs him politically. In fact, a lot of people think he might have won re-election had he not. Gerald R. Ford was not born in Michigan, but he moved here at a young age and was raised, as you guys probably know, in Grand Rapids. He played on the University of Michigan football team. He had done a protest as a college player, protesting Georgia Tech, who Michigan was playing at football at the time, because they didn't want to play Michigan because they had an African American player. So he had a little bit of a history for standing up for African American rights. He outlaws assassination, saying the U.S. government cannot use assassinating foreign leaders, etc., as a tool of diplomacy. He reigns in the CIA. He said, like previous presidents, just let the CIA get completely out of control. The CIA, according to Ford, the CIA was actually even doing assassination attempts on foreign leaders without even talking to the president at times. And so he reigns in the CIA, tries to control them, outlaws assassination. The U.S. can't do that. And he makes a big goal to make America energy independent. Why? Because of this whole OPEC mess up there, where they're not letting us buy as much of their oil as we want. Embargo, so we have to buy it through third parties or whatever, which increases the cost, and travel distance too, to be honest. But anyways, and he talks about reducing consumption. He talks about like helping the environment and global warming. He even touches on as president. That's like a relatively new concept at the time that he even talks about. Helsinki Accords, where we meet with the Soviet Union and we agreed to recognize all the current territorial claims of the Soviet Union. In exchange, the Soviet Union agrees to respect human rights more in regards to political dissidents, where they're like making people who criticize their government disappear in the middle of the night or locking them up. And it's trying to ease the U.S. and Soviet Union tensions during this Cold War, which many people say starts at the end of World War II and lasts till about 1991. So you're talking about a half century of severe tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union. And to be honest, some people argue it's still kind of going on today. We still to this day have severe tensions with Russia. And Russia was the biggest part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union breaks up into several countries, Russia being the biggest. But then Jimmy Carter becomes president in 1976 here. He's the former Georgia governor. He's like portrays himself as just this peanut farmer. And he has this Camp David Accords trying to bring peace to the Middle East. He's big on the environment and energy conversation. A lot of people don't like that though, because like when people complain that energy costs are too high, he says, well, just put on a sweater and turn down your thermostat to save money. And a lot of people don't want to hear that. They just want to hear, I want cheaper energy costs and stuff like that. I don't want to hear put on a sweater and turn down it. This really kind of does his presidency in. Iran has a revolution. They take a bunch of, because remember under Eisenhower we had put in a pro-American government, and that pro-American government, at least to our credit, it allowed women freedoms and minority freedoms, and you don't really see that as much with the new Iranian government. But the Iranian government takes a bunch of Americans hostage, and you have this huge hostage crisis, and it's just going to be a huge drag on his presidency. And you get this collapse of détente because the Soviets invade Afghanistan. The Carter Doctrine is to not allow the Soviet expansion into the Middle East or oil-producing areas. And America boycotts the Olympics in Moscow, and we're back to severe tensions with the Soviet Union and us again. Jimmy Carter is trying to work on SALT 2, something that, remember, Nixon had SALT 1, and it gets signed but not ratified. Later on, it kind of agrees to be followed informally, but that had a collapse, and it was seen as a sign of just the whole collapse of everything. Hey, we'll finish the rest of this chapter later, but that's good enough for now. Take care, students. Stay positive. Oh, yeah.